So I think it's fascinating to think about the shift between the geocentric and the heliocentric cosmologies, the so-called Copernican Revolution. It's fascinating to think about because, well, on the one hand, I think there's a more profound and inescapable truth to the geocentric perspective than we modern post-Copernican peoples generally admit. And on the other hand, heliocentrism is not as simple as Copernicus thought. You know, it turns out in the 20th century that, given Einstein's relativistic understanding of the speed of light and of gravitational influence resulting not from action at a distance but from the curvature of a space-time medium, given Einstein's understanding that motion, in fact, is relative. The only motion that is absolute is that of light, whereas all sub-light speed motion is relative, which means that, for example, yes, the Earth goes around the Sun from the Sun's point of reference. From the Earth's point of reference, no, the Sun's going around the Earth, right? But, it all depends on what perspective we want to take in the Einsteinian universe as to what's moving and what's not. If we take the perspective of the Milky Way galaxy, turns out the Earth is spiraling around the Sun as the Sun travels around the galactic center. And not only is the Sun just, orbiting in a straight line, but if you look at the computer depictions of what this would look like based on real measurements, the Sun is actually going around another invisible gravitational center, spiraling as the planets follow it through its spiral. So in terms of what's orbiting what, it starts to become a kind of improper question. Everything's orbiting everything else. The whole Milky Way galaxy is orbiting other galaxies in a giant galactic cluster, which itself, is twisting around within other galactic clusters and super clusters. And, it's an endless dance where it makes no more sense to say that the Earth is at the center than it does that the Sun is at the center. It turns out that the universe is kind of acentric, or all-centric, or omnicentric. The center is either nowhere or it's everywhere. Both of those statements, those seemingly opposed, are paradoxically simultaneously true. As the many Hermetic philosophers have said in the past, including Nicholas of Cusa, the universe is an infinite sphere whose circumference is nowhere, and so whose center is everywhere. Now, I think when we understand, modern Einsteinian astrophysics, whatever Copernicus may have discovered is true enough, but it's not the end of the story. The story, as we now understand it, is far more complicated. It's a far bigger universe and a more mysterious universe than we at first suspected. Now, as far as geocentrism goes, it's a plain fact about our phenomenological experience, which is something that, just as revolutionary as Einstein's theories of gravity and light were at the beginning of the 20th century, Husserl's grasp of our life world and the groundedness of all natural science and all abstraction in that life world, I think Husserl's discovery is just as revolutionary for philosophy as Einstein's was for physics at the beginning of the 20th century. So we're in a situation where, as Husserl put it, contrary to modern science, to that sort of Newtonian understanding of the scientist as the one who tries to take God's perspective on the universe, to understand it as God made it, which, from Galileo through Descartes and Newton, the universe was made out of numbers, out of mathematics. God is a mathematician, and the universe is the machine that he has designed as a sort of engineer or architect. This idea of modern science and the self-image of the modern scientist as the one who is supposed to take God's perspective has been totally undermined, both from within science by the revolutions in physics and relativity and quantum theories, but also in philosophy, where, from Husserl's perspective, as he put it, the Earth, the original arc, does not move. Right? So the Earth is the arc, or the arche, the oldest thing, or in fact the oldest god. Gaia. It was Gaia and chaos at the beginning. So, as Hesiod and other Greek poets have suggested, and what Husserl is really pointing to here, I think, in articulating a kind of post-Copernican geocentric philosophy, is that our experience is unavoidably grounded. Our experience is of a sunrise and a sunset. Our experience is of spiraling heavens up above. Geocentrism is inescapable, and there's this kind of fantasy of escaping the Earth, and it's as if when we launch one of our rocket ships into orbit and glance back to look at the Earth as a ball floating in space, it's as if we've actually, for the first time, achieved a sort of God's eye perspective and recognized recognized experientially what before had only been the geometrical fact of the sun's centrality relative to the Earth, to the Earth's orbit. It's as if we're there in outer space, which for Newton, space was the sensorium of God, as he put it. So we're out there, taking on God's sensorial capacity in space. But, to what extent is this a kind of industrial fantasy? Where, yeah, of course, I admit we've been into orbit. I tend to think we've also been to the moon, though I know these days everything's a conspiracy, right? But what's going on phenomenologically when the astronaut gazes back, or the cosmonaut gazes back at the Earth from space, or even from the moon? There's something strange going on there that I admit is difficult to square with a merely phenomenological perspective like Husserl's. Husserl begins to seem kind of nostalgic for a past that technology has made impossible to return to. So what are we to do with this view of Earth from the moon? I still think it's a revelation of the profoundly Earth-centered nature of our lives and of our existence here. We're living in the petroleum interval, and granted, some small chance exists that we will develop a technology to produce energy in a way that doesn't require oil or fossil fuel. But we don't have it yet, as far as I know. And we're running out of oil. And our industrial presence on the planet has basically brought us into what is increasingly looking to be, you can't really say for another million years, but we're on track for the sixth great mass extinction event in the history of our planet, the last one being 65 million years ago, when comet or an asteroid drove the dinosaurs into extinction. So I think very soon it's going to become difficult, if not impossible, to get into orbit. I don't really buy the technological utopian myths of progress that singularity theorists and post-humanists and whatnot are proliferating. I don't even really like the idea of being increasingly surrounded by and inundated by machines. I like the trees, but nor do I even think that these techno-utopian fantasies are possible for our future. I see a far more limited future for our species. And I think understanding what it means to look at the Earth from space, from the moon, what it means for human consciousness, at least, is that we're recognizing our limitedness. We're recognizing our vulnerability, the fragility of the Earth, and seeing that thin band of atmosphere that protects us from the harshness of deep space. And understanding that there's a dynamic electromagnetic field emanating from the molten core, volcanic core of our planet, that changes all the time, and that's affected by the sun's radiation and electromagnetic field, and that flips, the poles will flip ever so often. There's this living creature sustaining our civilization and our economy, and we've pretended for a couple hundred years during this industrial phase, and especially the last century or so with the petroleum interval, we've pretended that we had control of this spaceship. But it turns out that our situation is far more precarious than that, and that extinction has become a real possibility for us. And I don't dismiss, post-humanisms of all sorts. I think our species will survive in some form. I just don't know if it will be a form that leaves the Earth. I think some of us will return to dwelling in caves for a few thousand years and then erupt once the climate stabilizes again into a new form of civilization and city building. Hopefully not to repeat the whole cycle over again. But ultimately, we do seem to be wrapped up in cycles, right? Everything spinning. We hope spiraling, so at least then there's a trajectory here. But for the most part, it's best if we just hang on and go for the ride.